and lowered ability to fight them may occur.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Chuck Todd.
We have breaking news from the Supreme Court, and this has the potential to impact at least the political standing of the president and possibly the presidential race. The justices have just ruled against the president's attempts, against the president's attempts to shield his financial records and tax documents from New York prosecutors. NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams is with us to explain. And Pete, there were a couple of cases here having to do with the president's financial records. One was in New York City and one was with Congress. What do we know?
So the president must turn over his taxes to the grand jury in New York unless he can come up with the same kind of arguments that any other person would be able to raise as an objection in court. So the Supreme Court sent the Vance case, the New York grand jury case, back to the lower courts, but it took away all the arguments the president made about why he is different and special, that he's absolutely immune from the criminal justice process, and that allowing local district attorneys to seek things from the president would subject the president to harassment. So what the Supreme Court says is, okay, now go back to court and make the same kind of arguments anybody else would make about why you think these subpoenas are intrusive. It puts him on the same standard, basically, in other words, as anybody else trying to block a subpoena. Makes it much, much, much harder for the president to keep this material out of the hands of the grand jury in New York. On the congressional subpoena, the Supreme Court has also sent the case back. It is said the president absolutely can't say no, but it is said in a case like this where a congressional subpoena is so broad, there's a test that the lower courts have to apply. They have to make sure that this is tethered to some legitimate legislative purpose, that it's not going to harass the president. So it's set out a series of steps that the lower courts have to look at. So bottom line here, Chuck, number one, nothing's going to get resolved in these cases until after the election, because they go back to the lower courts. Whoever loses there has a chance to appeal. It could go back to the Supreme Court. That's the first thing. Second thing, even if the New York grand jury had gotten a complete, absolute win here, that wouldn't mean that we would see the president's tax records because of the rules of grand jury secrecy. Even if the grand jury ultimately gets the president's taxes and he can't come up with any good objection for why he shouldn't turn them over, they don't become public. And the only way that we would ever see them is if there's someone indicted and goes to trial and the taxes are introduced as evidence. So those are the two bottom lines. Nothing's going to be resolved before the election. We're not going to see any of this stuff on the congressional subpoenas. You know, if the president ever did turn over any of his business records to Congress, they might ultimately become public, but it's going to be months and months and months, possibly a year, maybe two, before this is fully resolved in court. So it's a mixed day for the president. He doesn't have to do anything right now, but the idea that he can put a barricade around the White House and say, no, I don't have to respond to any of you, that's a dead letter now.
All right, a couple questions for you, Pete. First one is, essentially the Supreme Court, it sounds like, has put down metrics, if you will, or sort of a checklist on what access Congress could have. I assume this now sets new precedent for presidents going forward. Is that what this decision will end up being for when it comes to the personal financial ties of presidents going forward?
Well, absolutely. Both of these decisions are precedent-setting because we've never had before. The Supreme Court has dealt before with the issues of whether presidents are immune from subpoenas. They answered that in the Nixon case. Are presidents immune from the legal process while they're in office? They answered that in the Clinton case. But we never had a case before of a state prosecutor seeking material from the president. And that raised all sorts of, you know, supremacy clause questions and everything else. So number one, the Supreme Court has said, you know, they shot down the president's two arguments, which was presidents are absolutely, because they can't be indicted while they're in office, they're immune from any part of the criminal justice process, including subpoenas. Okay, we now know that's not true. So yes, precedent is set there. And secondly, the court has laid out a number of tests that have to be applied when Congress and the president are at absolute loggerheads. Are these subpoenas narrowly focused? And, you know, frankly, I think the Democrats were their own worst enemies. These are such broad requests for documents from the presidents, his relatives, over many, many years. So are they sharply focused, the requests from Congress? Are they tied to a legitimate legislative purpose? Remember, Chuck, there's nothing in the Constitution that says Congress has subpoena power. The courts over the years have said, yeah, Congress needs to find things out when it wants to legislate. What Trump's argument here was, this is a fishing expedition. You just want all this stuff to poke through it and see if you can find something, then go, aha. And, you know, the Supreme Court sort of met him halfway on that one to say this has to be tied to some legitimate legislative purpose.
And Pete, very quickly, what were the makeups of the rulings?
Yeah, 7-2 on both cases. Roberts and the liberals, the dissenters in both cases were Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito.
Very interesting that both of President Trump's appointees ended up ruling, I guess you could argue, against the president here. Pete Williams, thank you. Let me move over to the White House, where Peter Alexander is standing. And Peter, I guess overall, the White House feels as if the Supreme Court has not been good to them in any of their political hopes and all of that. But on this particular case, how defiant do we expect the White House to be now that these rulings have gone against them?
Well, I think you'll certainly hear frustration that the president's two court appointees both sided against them in effect here. Obviously, that's one thing that's frustrated the president. But even as early as a matter of hours ago on Twitter, he was tweeting in all caps, presidential harassment. And that's the way that this president has viewed it. The benefit as they view it, I suspect, is that it's unlikely we see any of these documents, as Pete noted, before the election, which is crucial here. But this president, you'll note, has repeatedly claimed to be the most transparent president ever. Of course, he refused to turn over his taxes since he was a candidate in 2016. That would made him the only modern candidate in president not to turn over his financial information. The explanation then was that the taxes were under audit, but that hadn't prevented past presidents from turning them over, and it's not clear whether they are still under audit now more than 3 years later. The legal team, and I've been reaching out to them, I'll check my phone as I speak to you to make sure I haven't heard back for their immediate reaction from his legal team. They had argued this would be a major distraction to have to turn over all of that information. Worth noting, Chuck, on this very day that we learned that the president's annual financial disclosure report that was due to be released first in May, then a week ago after an extension, still has not been filed. That's the only official public document detailing his personal finances. Officials here this morning telling me the president filed a deadline extension because they say it was, quote, complicated, and that the president has, in their words, been focused on the coronavirus crisis and other issues. Chuck.
Very interesting that somehow his finances have gotten more complicated as he's been in office. One would assume in this case it would have gotten slightly less complicated, but very interesting spin from them. Thank you, Peter. Before that, thank you, Pete. You can find much more on MSNBC and on NBC News Now. And, of course, we'll have a full wrap-up on the NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. We'll return most of you back to the Today Show. I'm Chuck Todd, and this has been an NBC News Special Report.